January 6, 1066. Harold Godwinson is crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. 9 months later, he's dead on a battlefield with an arrow in his face, and England will never speak English again for 300 years. Harold wasn't supposed to be king. He wasn't royal blood. He seized the throne through political maneuvering, and 3 separate armies invaded to take it from him. He fought 3 major battles in 3 weeks, marched his army 500 miles in autumn, and came within hours of saving Anglo-Saxon England. Instead, he died at Hastings. The Normans conquered England, and 1,000 years of Saxon rule ended in a single day. This is the story of Harold Godwinson, the man who was king for 9 months and lost everything that mattered. Harold Godwinson was born around 1022 into the most powerful non-royal family in England. His father, Godwin, was Earl of Wessex, the largest and richest earldom in the kingdom. Godwin was a political operator, a survivor, and a kingmaker. Harold learned politics and power from watching his father manipulate kings. Here's the key thing: Harold had no royal blood. None. His family were Anglo-Saxon nobles who'd risen to power through wealth, military success, and political cunning. In normal circumstances, Harold would never be king. But 11th century England wasn't normal circumstances. Harold's sister Edith married King Edward the Confessor in 1045, making Harold the king's brother-in-law. This gave the Godwin family enormous influence. When Godwin died in 1053, Harold inherited his earldom and his political network. He became the most powerful man in England after the king. Harold was everything Edward the Confessor wasn't. Edward was pious, withdrawn, more interested in building Westminster Abbey than governing. Harold was energetic, military, political, and ambitious. He led campaigns in Wales, negotiated with nobles, managed the economy, and essentially ran England while Edward prayed. By the early 1060s, Harold controlled Wessex, his brother Tostig controlled Northumbria, his other brothers controlled other earldoms. The Godwinsons were the real power in England. And everyone knew it, but Harold had a problem: he wasn't royal. In Anglo-Saxon England, kings were supposed to come from the royal line. And Edward had no children. The succession was wide open, and multiple people had claims, some stronger than Harold's. At some point in 1064 or 1065, sources disagree on exactly when and why, Harold went to Normandy and met Duke William. What happened there is disputed and crucially important. The Norman sources, written after the conquest, say Harold swore a sacred oath to support William's claim to the English throne. They say Harold placed his hands on holy relics and promised that when Edward died, he'd help William become king. English sources either don't mention this or claim Harold was tricked, that he didn't know he was swearing on holy relics, or that he was forced to swear under duress. The truth? Probably somewhere in between. Harold likely did swear some kind of oath to William, but probably not as explicit or binding as Norman sources claim. Medieval politics were full of ambiguous promises and strategic vagueness, but William would later use this oath as justification for invasion, claiming Harold was an oathbreaker and a usurper. It gave William's invasion a veneer of legitimacy. He wasn't conquering England, he was claiming what was rightfully his. On January 5, 1066, King Edward the Confessor died after a brief illness. He was about 62, had reigned for 24 years, and left no children. His death triggered the succession crisis that had been building for years. According to some sources, Edward designated Harold as his successor on his deathbed. Whether this actually happened or was invented later is debated. But it gave Harold a claim, the dying king's choice. The next day, January 6, Harold was crowned king in Westminster Abbey. The speed was suspicious. Coronations usually took longer to arrange. Harold clearly wanted to establish facts on the ground before rivals could organize. If you're crowned and anointed, you're king. It's harder to challenge you, but 3 men immediately rejected Harold's kingship: Harald Hardrada of Norway, confusingly similar name, who claimed the throne through old Viking treaties, Duke William of Normandy, who claimed Harold had sworn to support him, and Harold's own brother Tostig, who'd been exiled from England and wanted revenge. Harold had the crown, but he'd have to fight to keep it. Harold spent the spring and summer of 1066 waiting for invasion. He knew it was coming. The question was, from where and when? he assembled an army in southern England to watch for William's fleet. He deployed ships to patrol the Channel. He waited through April, May, June, July. William was gathering an invasion force in Normandy but couldn't sail. The winds were wrong, blowing from the north, pushing ships away from England rather than toward it. Meanwhile, Harold Hardrada was preparing his own invasion from Norway. Tostig was gathering supporters and ships. Harold was facing potential invasion from 3 directions simultaneously. By early September, Harold had a crisis. His army had been mobilized for months. The FYRD, the militia of ordinary farmers and landowners who formed much of Anglo-Saxon armies, needed to go home for the harvest. You couldn't keep men in the field indefinitely when crops needed to be brought in, or everyone would starve that winter. Harold made a fateful decision. He disbanded his southern army and let the FYRD go home. He assumed the invasion season was over. It was too late in the year for safe sailing. The weather was turning, and William hadn't come. He was wrong. On September 20th, Harold Hardrada landed in northern England with a Norwegian army estimated at 10,000 to 15,000 men, plus supporting ships. Tostig was with him, acting as guide and co-commander. Hardrada was one of the most feared warriors in Europe. Hardrada means hard ruler or ruthless, a nickname he'd earned through decades of Viking warfare. He'd fought in Byzantine service, commanded the Varangian Guard, campaigned across the Mediterranean, and seized the Norwegian throne. He was in his 50s but still formidable. Tostig had promised Hardrada support in northern England. He claimed the Northumbrians hated Harold and would join their cause. He was partly right. The Northumbrians did resent Harold's family, who'd ruled them harshly. Hardrada's army sailed up the Humber River and advanced toward York, the capital of Northumbria. The northern earls, Edwin and Morcar, assembled an army to stop them. On September 20th, the English Northern Army met Hardrada at Gate Fulford, just outside York. The battle was brutal and decisive. Hardrada's Vikings were professional warriors, battle-hardened and experienced. The English Northern Army was largely the local FYRD, farmers and militia. The Vikings won decisively. Edwin and Morcar's army was shattered. York surrendered. Hardrada demanded hostages and supplies. It looked like northern England might become a Norwegian kingdom. When Harold heard the news in London, he made an instant decision: march north immediately with whatever forces he could gather. No waiting for the full army to assemble. No careful preparation. Just move, now, before Hardrada consolidated control. Harold's march north in late September 1066 is one of the most impressive military movements in medieval history. He covered roughly 200 miles in 4 to 5 days, an average of 40 to 50 miles per day. Medieval armies didn't move that fast. Typically, you'd expect 10 to 15 miles per day. Harold was driving his men at a pace that must have been exhausting. They were marching in armor, carrying weapons and supplies, through late September weather, but speed was essential. Every day Harold delayed gave Hardrada time to fortify York, gather more support, and prepare defenses. Harold needed to hit him fast. Before he was ready, Harold picked up additional forces as he marched: local FYRDS, Thegns with their personal retainers, anyone who could join the army quickly. By the time he reached Yorkshire, he probably had 10,000 to 15,000 men, roughly matching Hardrada's numbers. On September 25th, Harold's army arrived at Stamford Bridge, a crossing of the River Derwent about 7 miles east of York. Hardrada's army was there, collecting the hostages and supplies York had promised. The Vikings were caught completely by surprise. They'd thought Harold was still in London. They hadn't posted adequate scouts or guards. Many had left their armor behind because it was a warm day. Harold offered Tostig terms: return to England, be forgiven, receive back your lands. Tostig asked what Hardrada would get. Harold allegedly replied, 6 feet of English ground, or as much more as he needs, as he is taller than most men. The offer was rejected. Battle began. The fighting at Stamford Bridge was savage. Hardrada, caught without full armor, fought furiously but was killed by an arrow to the throat, the same way Harold would die 3 weeks later. Tostig took command and fought on. There's a famous legend that a single Viking warrior held the bridge against the English army, killing dozens before someone floated under the bridge in a barrel and stabbed him from below through the wooden planks. Probably exaggerated, but it captures how desperate and brutal the fighting was. Harold's army eventually overwhelmed the Vikings through sheer numbers and the advantage of surprise. Hardrada's army was destroyed. Tostig was killed. The Norwegians fled to their ships, having lost perhaps 80% of their force. Harold had won a stunning victory. He'd marched 200 miles in less than a week, surprised a Viking army led by one of Europe's most feared warriors, and destroyed them in a single afternoon, but he had no time to celebrate. 3 days after Stamford Bridge, Duke William of Normandy landed at Pevensey on the southern coast of England. The winds had finally changed. William's invasion fleet, perhaps 600 to 700 ships carrying 7,000 to 10,000 men plus horses, crossed the Channel and landed unopposed. Harold heard the news in York. His army was exhausted. They'd just fought a major battle. They'd marched 200 miles to get there. They'd taken casualties. And now he had to march 250 miles south to fight another invasion. Harold made another instant decision: march south immediately. Again, no rest. No careful preparation. Just move. William was ravaging the southern coast, burning villages, and fortifying positions. Every day Harold delayed gave William more time to prepare. Harold's march south in early October 1066 was even more brutal than the march north had been. His men were already exhausted. Many had been killed or wounded at Stamford Bridge. Others were left behind in northern England to garrison York and prevent any Viking survivors from regrouping. Harold probably had 7,000 to 8,000 men when he started south. He picked up reinforcements as he marched, more FYRD militia, more Thegns, more local forces. But many of these were fresh, untrained, and not integrated into his army. The march took about 10 days to 2 weeks, covering 250 miles. When Harold arrived in London around October 11th, his army was approaching collapse from exhaustion. His advisors and his brothers begged him to wait, to rest the troops, to gather more forces from the rest of England. Harold refused. William was fortifying Hastings, building a castle, and ravaging the countryside, Harold's own lands in Sussex. Every day William stayed in England made the invasion harder to dislodge. Harold wanted to hit him fast, surprise him like he'd surprised Hardrada, and throw him back into the sea before he could consolidate. It was the right strategic instinct. However, Harold's army was exhausted. William's was fresh. On October 14, 1066, Harold's army took up position on Senlag Hill, about 7 miles northwest of Hastings. It was good defensive ground, a ridge with steep slopes on the sides, marshes at the bottom, and forest at the back preventing retreat but also preventing flanking. Harold deployed his army in the traditional Anglo-Saxon shield wall, men standing shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, forming an almost impenetrable barrier. Behind the shield wall were the FYRD with spears, axes, and swords. At the center, on the highest point, stood Harold's personal bodyguard, the Housegiles, professional warriors equipped with two-handed Danish axes that could split horses and men in half. The army probably numbered 7,000 to 10,000 men, though estimates vary. Most were on foot. Anglo-Saxons fought as infantry, not cavalry. William's army assembled at the bottom of the hill. He had about 7,000 to 10,000 men as well, but his composition was different. He had archers, something Anglo-Saxon armies largely lacked. He had cavalry, heavily armored Norman knights. And he had infantry. William faced a problem: charging uphill against a prepared shield wall is nearly suicidal. Cavalry are vulnerable to infantry on high ground. His archers couldn't shoot effectively uphill. He needed the English to break formation, and they weren't stupid enough to do that. The battle began around 9 a.m. with Norman archers shooting uphill. Many arrows fell short or were blocked by shields. Some sources say the English threw the arrows back at the Normans, then William sent his infantry forward. They charged uphill and smashed into the shield wall. It held. The English were fighting defensively on ground they'd chosen, and they had the advantage. Norman infantry were pushed back down the hill with casualties, then William committed his cavalry. knights charged uphill on horseback and crashed into the English line. It should have been devastating. Armored cavalry were the tanks of medieval warfare. But the shield wall held. Some horses fell. Some knights were pulled from their saddles and killed with axes and swords. The Normans retreated. Rumors spread that William had been killed. His army began to panic and fall back in disorder. William had to remove his helmet and ride along the line showing his face, shouting that he was alive. This was the moment Harold might have won. If the English had pressed the attack while the Normans were disorganized, they might have routed them completely. But Harold held his position. The shield wall didn't break. William tried new tactics. He ordered his troops to fake retreats, to charge, then turn and run as if panicking. Some English broke formation to pursue, and when they did, Norman cavalry wheeled around and cut them down. This happened several times. Each time, part of the English line would break discipline, chase retreating Normans, and get killed when the Normans turned and fought. The shield wall was thinning. Harold's brothers Gwrth and Lefwine were killed in the fighting, probably during one of these pursuit actions, but the centre held. The housecarls around Harold stayed in formation. The shield wall, though damaged, was still functional. It was afternoon now. The battle had been raging for 6 to 7 hours. Both armies were exhausted. But the English were still on the hill, still holding, and William was running out of options. What happened next is legendary and disputed. According to the Bayeux Tapestry, a Norman propaganda piece made after the battle, Harold was struck in the eye by an arrow. The tapestry shows a figure labelled Harold with an arrow in his face, then another figure labelled Harold being cut down by Norman knights. Some historians think these are two different moments, Harold wounded by arrow, then killed shortly after. Others think it's the same moment shown twice. Some think Harold wasn't hit in the eye at all and that story was invented later to match biblical parallels. Absalom's death. What's certain, Harold died. Whether from an arrow to the eye, or from being hacked down by knights when his guard finally broke, or from some combination, Harold was killed on the battlefield in the late afternoon. With Harold dead, the English army lost cohesion. The housecarls fought to the death around Harold's body. That was their duty, to die with their lord. But the Fyrd broke and ran. The Normans pursued into the forest, killing fleeing English soldiers in the gathering darkness. The battle was over. The Normans had won, barely, after 8 to 9 hours of fighting. Their casualties were heavy, perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 dead, including many knights. But the English casualties were worse, perhaps 4,000 to 5,000 dead, including King Harold and most of his best warriors. William searched the battlefield for Harold's body. According to Norman sources, Harold's face was so mutilated that he could only be identified by marks on his body that his mistress Edith Swanneck recognized. William buried him, probably at Battle Abbey, which William later built on the site, but the battle that day decided more than Harold's life. It decided the future of England for the next 1,000 years. After Hastings, England was essentially defenseless. Harold's army was destroyed. His brothers were dead. The northern earls had been defeated at Gatefulford. There was no organized military force capable of resisting William. The English nobility briefly tried to rally around Edgar the Aetheling, a teenage member of the old royal family. But without an army and without Harold's leadership, the resistance collapsed. On Christmas Day 1066, William was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. The Norman conquest is probably the most consequential military victory in English history. More than just a change of kings, it was a complete cultural, linguistic, and social transformation. For the next 300 years, England's rulers spoke French. The aristocracy spoke French. The court spoke French. Latin was the language of the church. English, Old English, the language of Beowulf and Anglo-Saxon poetry, became the language of peasants. By the time English re-emerged as England's dominant language in the 14th century, it was transformed. Modern English is about 60% Latin French and only 40% Germanic, directly because of the Norman conquest. Words for high-status things, government, law, art, food, are often French-derived. Words for everyday things are often Anglo-Saxon. If Harold had won at Hastings, English would sound completely different today. It would be much more like German or Dutch. The entire development of the English language changed because of a single battle. William imposed Norman feudalism on England, a strict hierarchical system of land ownership in exchange for military service. He confiscated Anglo-Saxon land and gave it to his Norman followers. By 1086, almost all English land was owned by Normans. This created one of the most centralized, bureaucratic states in medieval Europe. William's Domesday Book of 1086 was a comprehensive survey of English land and resources that wouldn't be matched for centuries. England became efficiently governed, heavily taxed, and politically stable under Norman control. Some historians argue England's later rise as a world power started here. The Normans created strong institutions, centralized authority, and military efficiency that gave England advantages over more fragmented European kingdoms. The Norman conquest also marked the end of England's Viking connections. For 200 years, England had been culturally and politically part of Scandinavian world. Viking raids, Danish kings like Knut, constant interaction with Norway and Denmark. After 1066, England's orientation shifted permanently toward continental Europe, especially France. English kings would spend centuries trying to control parts of France. The cross-channel connections became central to English foreign policy for the next 400 years. What if Harold had won at Hastings? It's one of history's great counterfactuals. If Harold had rested his army after Stamford Bridge, if he'd waited for reinforcements, if he'd fought more defensively at Hastings, if he'd retreated when he could, maybe he wins. Maybe William's invasion fails like so many Viking raids had failed before. Then Anglo-Saxon England continues. English remains a Germanic language. England stays oriented toward Scandinavia. Feudalism develops differently or not at all. The entire trajectory of English and European history changes, but Harold was exhausted, impulsive, and unlucky. He made the defensible decision to attack quickly. It had worked against Hardrada. But William was better prepared and luckier. The battle was close, it could have gone either way. Harold almost pulled it off. Instead, he died with an arrow in his face, and everything changed. For centuries after the conquest, Harold was barely remembered in official histories. The Normans wrote the history books, and they portrayed Harold as an oathbreaker, a usurper, and a failed king who ruled for less than a year. But English folk memory preserved Harold as the last English king, the man who died trying to defend England from foreign invasion. Over time, especially as English identity re-emerged distinct from Norman, Harold became a symbol of resistance and English nationalism. Modern historians are more nuanced. Harold was a capable military leader and a shrewd politician. He nearly won at Hastings despite enormous disadvantages. He made reasonable strategic choices that happened not to work. He was unlucky more than incompetent, but he wasn't a saint or a perfect hero. He seized the throne through political maneuvering, not clear right. He was ruthless in warfare. His campaigns in Wales were brutal. He was ambitious and opportunistic. He was a product of brutal 11th century politics, not some idealized English patriot. After Harold, there would never be another Anglo-Saxon king of England. The line was broken. England was conquered, transformed, and integrated into Norman French culture. In that sense, Harold really was the end of 1,000 years of Anglo-Saxon England that started with the migrations of the 5th century and ended on a battlefield in Sussex on October 14, 1066. He was king for 9 months. He fought 3 battles in 3 weeks. He came within hours of saving Anglo-Saxon England, and he lost everything. Harold Godwinson was crowned King of England on January 6, 1066. He was dead by October 14 of the same year, 9 months and 8 days. In that time, he faced 3 separate invasions, fought 3 major battles, marched his army over 500 miles, and came closer to defeating William the Conqueror than history usually acknowledges. He was not supposed to be king. He had no royal blood. He seized the throne through political maneuvering and royal deathbed designation. 3 armies invaded to take it from him, 2 led by men named Harold. In one of history's confusing coincidences, he defeated one invasion brilliantly at Stamford Bridge, destroying Harold Hardrada's Norwegian army in a surprise attack. Then he marched his exhausted army 250 miles south and nearly defeated William at Hastings despite every disadvantage, but nearly isn't enough. Harold died on the battlefield, probably with an arrow in his face, though we're not certain. His army broke. The Normans won. And England changed forever. The language we're speaking right now is different because Harold lost. English law, English government, English culture, all shaped by the Norman conquest that followed Harold's death. For the next 300 years, England's rulers didn't even speak English. Harold was the last king of the Saxons. After him came Normans, then Angevins, then later dynasties mixing French and English. But never again would an Anglo-Saxon sit on the English throne. He reigned for 9 months. He's remembered 1,000 years later. And he represents the last moment when English history could have gone a completely different direction, if only the winds hadn't changed, if only he'd rested his army, if only an arrow had flown slightly differently, but it didn't. And everything changed. If Harold had won at Hastings, how different would England be today? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.